Yeah, we're up here doing some habitat work with Kip, and you know, it's nice when you can time work to be like late April, early May. Tennessee season's pretty much shut down at that point, and Kip was nice enough to host us and up here and shot a bird out of a burn on Tioga State Forest. So it was very good. But anyway, so the frequency varies not only with your latitude, but also with the plant community you're in. For example, if you're in a field, you have to burn more frequently than if you're in the woods to maintain similar plant community because the shade is going to slow that vegetation response. Oh, frozen up on me here. All right, so intensity is the second thing that influences fire effects. So a lot of y'all may think this is a kind of piddly fire, but you can see good fire effects from this. And especially for landowners that are interested in using a fire for the first time, this is obviously a lot better than them going out there and burning and having 10-foot flame heights and you know, running across a field. But of course, if you're in fuels and you're in conditions, especially during the dormant season and early growing season, you can easily have effects like this. And you know, if there were trees in this unit, obviously our fire effect would be we'd be killing a bunch of those trees. And then finally, we have seasonality. And I listed them in these order because based on data that we have, we think that seasonality probably is the least important out of these three, but that does not mean it's not important. And so typically we're thinking about either burning during the dormant season or during the growing season. And really, when we talk about growing season burns throughout this talk, I'm kind of going to break it down into two periods. The early growing season, which would be April, May, up here would probably be more May, even into early June. And then the late growing season, which would be more August through September. And so regardless of whether we burn early or late growing season, we may see some differential effects based on that fire. But one thing that complicates this from a research and from a management perspective is that there's a lot of interaction between these factors. For example, if we burn really frequently, we generally are not going to have as intense of a fire because we're not building up those fuels. Similarly, and of particular interest for what we're talking about here with seasonality, if we burn during different seasons, our intensity may not be as great. And here's a great example of this. So this graph shows the maximum temperature that we're reaching on burns during the early growing season, there in orange on the left, and then the late growing season in gray on the right. First thing that may stand out, I don't know how well you can see the temperatures, but man, these burns are only getting up to like 250 or 300 degrees. And this is measured using a combination of fire indicating paints that we put on tiles throughout the stand, and we just document whichever paint is melted, and that's the maximum temperature. And we also use what we call data loggers paired with a thermocoupler to measure fire intensity and fire temperature. And essentially, it's just a little device that you hook up to a glorified meat thermometer. And that tells us exactly the amount, the temperature, as well as the residence time of that fire. And so we've gotten some really good data from this. But one of the main things we see here is early growing season fires, as well as dormant season fires, tend to be have a greater temperature than those burns during the late growing season. And that was some data that I pulled from some hardwood sites. This is data from pine stands where we're doing a larger regional fire project. And here we have paired up in the gray bar, we have temperature, and in the orange bar, we have the rate of spread in feet per second of late growing season, dormant, and early growing season burns. Now, the dormant and early growing season burns look relatively similar with regards to a little bit lower temperature than dormant, but you know, they're relatively similar. But what really stands out is that late growing season fire is moving much more slowly across these units. This is not because of differences in firing technique or anything like that. It's just different fuel conditions that reduce the intensity and the rate of spread of that burn, which again, isn't necessarily a bad thing depending on your objectives. So I'm going to briefly discuss all this in the context of two different fire seasonality projects. The first one I'm going to just briefly discuss and pull a couple data points from is a Bridgestone Firestone fire demonstration area, which is in Central Tennessee. And then I'm also going to talk more intensively about a project we had pairing shelterwood harvests with prescribed fire during two different seasons. And so first, I'm going to talk about the Bridgestone Firestone fire demonstration units. You may be wondering why it's named after a tire company. This WMA was donated to the state of Tennessee by the Bridgestone Firestone Company, and they subsequently turned it into a WMA where they're managing with quail as a big focal species there. And so this stand was clear cut in the early 2000s, and it was pretty much left until around 2011. They wanted to implement, my advisor as well as the manager wanted to implement a prescribed demo unit in Tennessee because we didn't have anything like this. And so we have 6 different fire treatments within this area that's a developing shortleaf and oak savanna. So we have a 1, 2, and 3 year fire return interval. And with each of those, we have an early growing season and a late growing season burn. And this has been ongoing since 2011. So actually in the annual units, we've now burned them 12 or 13 times, which outside of a few places like Tall Timbers, that's a pretty long-term project, especially for a high fire frequency. There's not a lot of places like this that have ongoing data collection. So it's a really cool site that's pretty unique. And so there are some differences based on frequency between the 1, 2, and 3 year, but I want to highlight here 2 differences based on the seasonality that I think are important. The first one's going to show differences in seasonality in warm season grass coverage. And so here in the pink line or red line shows early growing season burns. The blue line shows late growing season burns. And then on the bottom here on the x-axis, we have the year. So this is just showing data points throughout all the years that we collected data, showing the change in coverage between the early growing season and late growing season in terms of warm season grasses. So we do see more warm season grass coverage in the early growing season compared to the late growing season. And this is likely related to the phenology of those plants and the flowering of those plants. After we burn in April and May, they can really bust out and do well. Whereas if we burn them in the late growing season, we tend to suppress them a little bit more. But again, we're still seeing an increase in coverage over time, which could be a good thing, could be a bad thing, all depending on your objectives. The second point that I wanted to highlight was within these areas, we also do mid-story plots. And so we collect data on mid-story trees. And we've actually seen a fair amount of recruitment, even with a 1, 2, and 3 year fire return interval out of the mid-story into the overstory. So that's part of the reason why you see a decline in both the early and the late growing season units in terms of mid-story trees. Some of those trees are being suppressed back into the understory. Some are actually being recruited into the overstory. But regardless of that, what we're seeing here is actually more trees in the mid-story in the late growing season units compared to the early growing season units. This may contrast some information that even, I've told folks before that, hey, if you burn in the late growing season, it's a good time for killing trees that you might want to keep out of the overstory and even ding them back out of the mid-story back into the understory. And while it's true that the phenology of those plants are do get hurt pretty badly when you burn them in August, the overriding factor here is intensity. So when we burn during the late growing season, we have a lower intensity, which doesn't allow us to top kill some of those plants, which again, could be a good thing, could be a bad thing, depending on our objectives. So I'm now going to shift and discuss things within this more hardwood dominated forest. This is the Chuck Swan Shelterwood and Fire Project. This is a project on Chuck Swan State Forest and Wildlife Management Area, which is north of Knoxville. And this was implemented first in 2010. We followed up a shelterwood harvest. We'll now call it a shelterwood with reserves because we have not taken over wood. There's still 50 to 60 square foot of predominantly oak and hickory remaining in these stands. And we followed that up with burning. We've tried to get it on a 2 year fire return interval, but it's ended up being more like a 2.5 year just with weather constraints and things like that. But it's been burned 6 times starting in 2012. And in each of the shelterwood harvest units, we have an area that wasn't harvested or burned, so that serves as our control. And we're comparing that to areas that we've cut and applied late growing season fire and then cut and applied early growing season fire. And for y'all's purposes, you may shift those dates a little bit. I know April here is not, most of April at least, leaf out has not occurred. So you may shift those dates a little bit more towards the middle of summer. But the point is we burn it during 2 different times of year that represent, 2 different distinct times in terms of plant response. And I first want to just show a picture of what these units look like. I took this picture in July of 2023, which was about 3 months after the early growing season fire occurred and about 8 months after the late growing season fire occurred. And of course, in the control that hasn't been cut or burned, there's virtually no understory plants growing, also very little tree regeneration. So that's, to be expected. But what's interesting is just how quickly these plants are responding and the variation that we're seeing in both the structure as well as a little bit of composition based on timing of fire. Although if you look closely in these, you can see a lot of top-killed plants and then a lot of this understory in both the early and the late growing season. I mean, you see a few forbs here, but a lot of the plants in both of these is comprised of woody stems. And I think that's a big expectation we have when managing hardwoods in this setting is, man, we're going to turn it into a woodland. It's going to look like there's pine trees there that, we see these pretty pictures of. And I don't think that's necessarily a realistic objective in a lot of these oak history systems, because you have trees out in the stand that are consistently trying to regenerate, and you have rootstock that has been there for years since you applied these treatments. And so the reality is there's a lot of woody plants that are going to persist, but that doesn't mean that you can't meet wildlife objectives in these areas. These still can provide, and in this context, I'm going to be talking about for turkeys and deer, a lot of really good resources if we burn appropriately. But the thing you got to stay on top of is, unlike with forbs or grasses, these are consistently trying to grow into the mid-story, so your frequency has to be relatively frequent. Otherwise, you're going to lose this, and it's going to turn into something that you don't necessarily want it to be. The other thing that I'll note, just looking at these pictures, I don't show data on this, but a lot of the regeneration we're seeing in these are oaks. So if you're trying to regenerate oaks, I think there's been enough conversation on the shelter wood and fire technique, but just know after burning 6 times, it's not like we're losing some oak component. We have a lot of accumulated recruitment there that if we wanted to step back and take our foot off the gas a little bit, we could regenerate this into an oak forest pretty easily. All right, so now I'm going to be discussing the understory coverage in these stands. And again, this was collected the summer after the prescribed fires happened. This was in June of 2023 or July of 2023. And so for each of these, there's going to be 3 bars. The first bar on the left there, the white bar that's pretty short on all of them, represents the control, so no fire, no timber harvest. The orange bar represents the early growing season burn paired with a shelterwood harvest, and the gray bar represents late growing season fire paired with a shelterwood harvest. So the first thing that stands out on forb coverage, we don't have as great a forb coverage as we might like to see managing for deer and turkeys, but we still have a lot more forb coverage in the areas where we've cut and burned compared to an unharvested control. They don't differ from each other. We have about 15 to 20% forb coverage in either the early or the late growing season. With grass coverage, and this is predominantly native warm season grasses in these systems, we see a similar trend with about 15% grass coverage when we've cut and burned, and almost no grass coverage where we haven't applied any treatments. So for herbaceous plants, what we're seeing, at least in these systems, the seasonality of fire does not really matter as much as we might have thought, and I'm going to get into that here in just a minute. And now we do see a little bit of a difference in bramble coverage, and that includes blackberry, raspberry, and greenbrier. We see that both early and late growing season fire, of course, have more bramble coverage than the unburned control, but we see greater coverage of blackberry and those other species in the late growing season fire treatment compared to the control. Vine coverage, we didn't have a lot of vines in these stands, not much difference between the units. Shrub coverage, of course, when we open the canopy and apply some disturbance, we're going to be promoting a lot of shrubs, and this included a lot of blueberry species compared to the controls, but there's no difference between the 2 treatments. And then finally, with tree coverage, we actually had a decent amount of tree coverage in the control. A lot of that's just suppressed red maple and yellow poplar in the understory, but we actually are starting to see a bump in tree coverage, and there's almost a third more tree coverage in the late growing season unit compared to the early growing season unit. So really, in summary, herbaceous plants are responding relatively equally, but we are seeing more brambles and more trees in the late growing season unit opposed to the early growing season unit. And in these hardwood systems that have a little bit more difficult fuels to burn, there's, of course, only 15% grass coverage. We think this is totally related to the frequency of the fire, the intensity of the fire and the time since fire. So in terms of the intensity of the fire, of course, we're not having as intensive fire, so some of those trees and some of those brambles are escaping the fire. And we also are sampling 8 months after the late growing season compared to just 3 months after the early growing season treatment. So we are seeing some differences based on just the timing of sampling, but we can't go out there and sample plants in the winter because we're not going to pick anything up. So in summary, before I shift to wildlife-centric effects on vegetation, the return interval really overrides everything. That's the most important thing in terms of seeing fire effects, is just your fire return interval. If we look at some other data that we have along with the data that I presented, the early growing season and dormant season fires may increase grasses in some systems, Probably not in hardwoods, but especially in pines or in early successional communities, we've got a lot of data that show that burning in the early growing season or the dormant season is going to increase grass coverage. And then the mid-story tree response is tied really closely to intensity. If you're having a low intensity of burning that's allowing some trees to escape from the understory into the mid-story, you're probably going to see some seasonal effects, quote unquote, but it's not really season, it's just how hot the burn got. And that's, again, a key thing because those late growing season fires tend to not be as intense. So I'm going to shift now to talking more about wildlife effects. Again, I want to emphasize that for most species that we're interested in managing for, especially game species, having fire alone on the landscape is going to override any seasonal effects. Don't get locked into burning during, just the month of April or just the month of August. Having fire on the landscape is the most important thing. There are some direct effects that we might be concerned with, and I think especially when we talk about growing season fire, a lot of folks get up in arms about both direct mortality for a lot of reptiles and reptile species. That can be a concern, as well as nest loss for ground nesting birds like turkeys. Now, both of these overlap pretty well, and that early growing season burn, unfortunately, kind of lines up with when turkey nests are on the ground and a lot of animals are coming out of the ground. They're relatively slow moving. The thing I'd mention with this is, there are benefits to those same species with burning during that period of time. Just consider the scale. Not lighting up 1,000 acres during the early growing season, is a pretty reasonable approach. And trying to make things during that period of the year relatively fine scale to make sure that it, makes sense with the biology of the animal. But what we really want to talk about are positive things, and those would be the indirect effects. So the effects on the plant community that are then affecting the wildlife use. And the first one's going to be forage. It's interesting talking about earlier the various species responding of butterflies responding to the food value. Well, we see the same thing with deer. And I'll show you some graphs here in just a second that discuss that. But, during the short period following fire, we see some really good flush of nutrients in those plants. And even the woody plants, which would not normally be all that highly selected. So something like red maple, you can upvalue that and make it something that's really valuable to a deer, whereas normally it serves as some winter browse, but it's not something that you should expect them to be eating during the summertime. And something that's interesting with this, whenever we start collecting vegetation data on deer forage specifically, this graph shows the pounds per acre of forage in those stands at Chuck Swan I mentioned earlier, where we've implemented a shelterwood harvest paired with early growing season or late growing season fire. Although they don't statistically differ, you'll note that there's actually a little bit more forage biomass in the late growing season unit compared to the early growing season unit because it's been about 5 months longer since the burn occurred. It has more time to grow and produce more biomass. However, whenever we consider the quality of these forage plants along with the quantity, that relationship flips. So this graph shows the deer days per acre, which I won't bore you with the details on that, but essentially it is taking into account the quality of forage that's sufficient to support a doe that's lactating or a buck growing antlers. So for example, in the early growing season unit, per acre, we could support about a doe that's lactating for about 30 days because the quality of the forage is that much higher, whereas we could only support a doe lactating in the late growing season unit for about 15 days. So about twice as much nutritional carrying capacity in those units, despite the fact that there's less pounds per acre of biomass. So again, just to emphasize here, we're talking about quality. The quality of the forage is really what we want to be managing for with deer. But we also have cover effects. So for example, this stand was burned during the early growing season, and I took this picture in July. This looks vastly different to a lot of species to something that's right across the fire break that was just burned 5 months previously. Now, again, this is somewhat site specific, and how quickly plants respond obviously varies a lot, but there is wildlife value to each one, but you need to consider having both available if the species that you're managing for requires both. And so something that we wanted to do in these units at this project where we were applying fire during these different seasons was consider deer use. So we did what any good deer hunter would do. We threw some trail cameras out in the stand and saw what happened. So we evaluated deer use with trail cameras, and we did this during the months of May through August. And those are really important from a deer biology perspective. They're the times that does are dropping fawns, which gestation is a pretty stressful process. And then we have lactation, which is the most stressful process deer go through. And then obviously we're also concerned with antler growth, and all that's happening during that summer period. So It's easy to think about deer forage during the fall when you may have a food plot out or something like that, but this is really the period that deer biology requires a lot of highly nutritious forage. And so what we saw was that especially during May and June, we had greater use in the early growing season burn units. So across the board throughout the summer, this graph shows deer use in the 3 treatments. Again, that's control, early growing season, and then late growing season in gray. And then we have 2 periods we consider. We considered early summer, May and June, and then late summer in July and August. And this is all happening, again, the early growing season burn occurred in April. So we're only talking about a month to 2 months later. We're seeing this huge spike in deer activity relative even to other areas that we know have a good amount of forage in them. Because the deer are selecting so strongly for that forage, even though it's pretty short on the ground, it's going to be highly nutritious. Now, even by July and August, we start to see these differences even out. Across the summer, we see more deer use in the cut and burn compared to the unharvested and unburned control, which makes sense. There's nothing, almost nothing for deer in a closed canopy hardwood forest during the summertime, aside from some shade. But it's just interesting to note that we see this huge resource pulse that deer really key in on in the 1 month or 2 following fire. And then even within 4 months later, it's kind of equaled out to another area. So having, consistent burning occurring across a property or across a landscape where you're interested in deer is a really key thing. You can't just expect that just because you burned an area 2 years ago, it's still providing high quality forage. Certainly it's better than having closed canopy woods there, but it's still not going to equal a stand that was burned just 2 months before. We also wanted to evaluate turkey use. So we did this during that same period of May through August, and we considered both brooding as well as summer foraging. Because at the end of the day, these are the periods that we're really concerned with, especially brooding is a really important thing for turkeys, and that's probably the most limiting thing for turkeys on the landscape is areas that they can successfully take a brood. You essentially need good cover at ground level, but you want almost no vegetation above about knee height, because above that, you're just inhibiting the ability of that hen to see and detect predators, and they're not going to use it very much. So you need some cover on the ground that's going to provide insects and cover for the poults, but you don't want vegetation above about knee height. And in these units, we actually saw a little bit different trend. We saw greater use in the early growing season, but it was throughout the entirety of the summer. So whether we were evaluating it during May and June or during July and August, we saw greater turkey detections following that early growing season burn. We saw some use in the control, and we saw a little bit of use in the late growing season, but not very much. And this might lead you to believe that, well, man, I don't need to burn for turkeys in the late growing season. If I'm interested in turkeys, I should just burn in April and May. And that would be the incorrect thing to draw from this, because the late growing season unit, because it's had more time since fire, is actually promoting really good nesting structure. Now, we didn't have cameras out in the units in April or early May to quantify nesting, and it really wouldn't have done anything for us anyway, because that hen's not moving around very much. So we probably would not have had many detections. But if we put transmitters on these birds in these units, it is pretty certain that they're not going to be nesting in the spot that was burned 2 weeks ago. They're going to be nesting in this, and this is, based on the literature, pretty much on par with what we would expect turkeys to be nesting in. And so by having different seasons, we're promoting different resources for these species that require various things throughout the year. Similarly, this is really good fawning and bedding cover for deer, especially fawning cover. And that's another important thing to note. Having these in close proximity, at least within these stands, these were about 2-acre units. A hen could nest in these units and then take her brood right across the fire break into the early growing season unit. And similarly, a doe could drop a fawn in this unit, and then she could go forage and get the nutrients that she needs in that early growing season unit. So having these things tied together and in close proximity is really important when we're managing for these species. And so in summary, I don't want this to be lost in translation. Consider any day throughout the year as a potential burn day. Don't get locked into burning just during April and May or just during the fall. Consider any time during the year. Now, of course, any day is not a burn day, because if there's snow on the ground, you can't burn. And if it's raining, you can't burn. But don't get locked into these tight little weather windows. Consider any day throughout the year, because if you're burning throughout the year, you're promoting heterogeneity, which is really beneficial to a lot of these species. It's also important to consider the scale, especially whenever we're talking about early growing season fire, because if there are some sensitive species to that. We really should consider scale with any burn, but especially during that time period, it's pretty important. With that being said, though, we showed that there were some really good benefits to early growing season fire, so don't rule it out just because you're worried about turkey nesting, for example. And then finally, wildlife benefit from varied fire seasonality. And so as managers, if that's something you're interested in, that should be something that you should be trying to promote, is having fire throughout the year during different time periods across a property. With that, I'd like to thank the University of Tennessee School of Natural Resources, the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency, and the Tennessee Valley Authority, all for providing both financial and logistical support for getting some of these projects done. And if I've still got time, I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.